LeaderCast.
Hi, and welcome to Deep Leadership. I'm your host, John Rennie. Well, I hope all is well with you today. It is Sunday morning, and I'm drinking a hot cup of Bottom Gun coffee from my friends at bottomguncoffee.com. I have another great show lined up for you, but before we get started, I just wanted to make a few quick announcements. First of all, you might have heard, I have a new book coming out. It's called You Have the Watch, a guided journal to become a leader worth following. Now, this is a journal for leaders that will walk you through an entire year of leadership training. There are 50 themes in the book, and each day you'll reflect on a different facet of that theme. So this journal is kind of designed for you to sit on your desk at work and give you something to read and reflect on for about 15 minutes each morning. Leadership skills are like any other skills. You need to practice them if you want to get better at them. And this new journal helps leaders practice those skills. So if you're interested in learning more about this new journal or pre-ordering this book, you can go to youhavethewatch.com and you can find out more information. You can place a pre-order. I'll be putting more information out in the next few weeks, so stay tuned. I also want to remind our listeners that the Deep Leadership Podcast is ranked by Listen Score as one of the top 5% shows in the world. Yes, that's 2.7 million podcasts, and we're in the top 5%. And the reason for that is because of listeners like you who listen every week, you subscribe, and you tell your friends about it, and I really appreciate it. So thank you for getting the word out. Now, if you're looking to support what I do on this show, you can purchase any one of my books at johnsrennie.com, and podcast listeners can get an additional discount if you enter the discount code DEEP at checkout. Well, that's it. Today, my guest is Rob Ashton. Now, Rob is a writer, entrepreneur, and scientist. Now, he's an expert in the science behind the words that we read and write. If you think about it, we use the written word more than any other communications method in our roles as leaders. So whether it's, emails, texts, Slack posts, proposals, plans, the words we choose are essential for our ability to influence others. Now, Rob helps us understand the science behind those words and how we can improve our writing to be more influential. This is an episode you didn't think you needed to hear, but it's one that you're never going to forget. So, are you ready to dive in? Let's get started.
Welcome to Deep Leadership. Leadership is a people business. That's the philosophy of your podcast host, John Rennie. As a former Cold War submarine officer who spent 20 plus years leading businesses in corporate America before starting his own manufacturing business, he knows that leadership matters. Are you ready for some real-world actionable advice from John as well as his expert guests?
I'm ready.
The show starts right now.
Welcome to the Deep Leadership Podcast. Today I'm joined by Rob Ashton. Rob is a writer, entrepreneur, and former scientist who has been researching the science behind the process of reading and writing for the past 6 years. His research runs the gamut of cognitive and social neuroscience, cognitive and social psychology, and behavioral and neuroeconomics. He is also the founder of the global learning company, Emphasis, that specializes in written communication. They have helped more than 70,000 people make more impact with their professional writing. In his estimation, much of the written communication of leaders simply doesn't work. I'm excited to have him on the show to talk about the importance of the written word in leadership. So, Rob, welcome to the show.
Hey, John. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, I'm excited about this episode. We haven't covered the issue of written communication as leaders, so this is going to be the first time, and I'm excited about it. And I gotta know, how did you get involved in learning and researching the science behind the written word?
Well, as you mentioned in your intro there, I started off as a scientist before a love of words led me into publishing. And I worked first of all, in technical publishing and then consumer publishing for years. Before then setting up a training company to take the skills that I'd learned as an editor and give them to people who are in the working world outside of publishing. But I guess, I'm still at heart a scientist. I'm always curious about the mechanisms. I'm a skeptic. I'm rather fond of evidence. I don't just accept things at face value. So I wanted to go back and find out why what we were recommending worked. It seemed to work, but that was just anecdotal. And when I started doing that, I realized two things. One was a lot of the advice that's out there on the web and in the leadership world is really quite bad advice based on a lot of pseudoscience and hearsay and wishful thinking. But I also discovered that there's a huge wealth of research out there that runs it covers all of those areas you mentioned, that simply hasn't made it out of academia and into the wider working world. So, naively, I thought I'd start researching that for a book, and I gave myself 6 months, and here I am 6 years later. It's the Dunning-Kruger effect. I simply didn't know what I didn't know. Any scientist working in those fields would have just laughed, I think, but I was naive. And it's been a great journey, but my goodness, there's a lot out there.
Yeah, that's really interesting because, I think we sometimes trivialize how important our words are, and you're discovering through this deep dive, I would say a very deep dive, that there's a lot more to it than we imagine.
Absolutely, and particularly the written word, because there is a lot of advice on verbal communication, but I think that when it comes to writing, first of all, we tend to focus on grammar and punctuation and spelling. If we think, we either think of writing a novel or that kind of creative writing. Or if we're thinking about business writing, we tend to think of grammar, punctuation, getting those basics right. And while those are important, if you get them wrong, they can be distracting. I think grammar, for instance, is to good writing what brushing your teeth is to a relationship. People are going to notice if you don't do it, but it's hardly the basis on which to build something valuable. So it's in fact, I was in a forum yesterday and someone was asking for help with written communication, and somebody else chipped in and said, oh yes, we cover the basics, if you want. And I just thought, no, it's not the basics. This written communication has become the channel that we use most of the time for communicating, especially since the COVID-19 pandemic hit, and we all dispersed to the four corners of the virtual world.
Yeah.
And people use Slack, they use email, and of course we know about report writing and proposal writing. But even if you try and get in touch with a company, you try and get in touch with your gas company or your electricity company, and you've got a query, you're probably going to have to use live chat, and that's writing too. It's writing all the way. Yeah,
we're doing more writing. You're right. I mean, think even text messaging, right? We don't even like people talking to us on the phone. Just send me a text, right? And so that is all that is written word, written communication, and all of that can be misunderstood, right? So that's what I imagine we're going to talk about today. Let me ask you, just in general, as leaders, what are we getting wrong? Why do we need to look at writing differently as leaders?
Well, I think first of all, it's trivializing the writing itself. It's what tends to happen is we might give somebody a report and say, do one like that. We tend to over-rely on written communication. The thing with writing is, when I say this, people kind of look at me, as if I'm mad, but we did not evolve to read and write. Now, if you think about it, that makes sense, but it's just something we forget. And there are even neuroscientists who don't really address that issue. We've been writing as a species for 5,000 to 6,000 years. And it takes to evolve a major structure in the brain. So, we can see, we can hear. Those kinds of structures take about 1 million years or more to evolve. So we didn't evolve to read and write. So it's something that's a lot harder than we realize. If we're reading something, there's a lot going on. And so if we over-rely on that medium, we're asking for trouble. If we stay stuck in Slack or in email trying to address a complex issue, then the brain is, it's hard drive, if you like, and there are problems with thinking of the brain as a computer. Maybe we can touch on that later, but the brain's hard drive is really working quite hard already just to read or just to write. And there's very little capacity left for nuance. So one of the major problems there is relying on written communication, particularly for emotive issues. You're not going to be able to deal with any fallout, and you're probably not going to get the reaction you want. Of course, nowadays, you mentioned texting on your phone, and if you send a message, you don't know where somebody is going to be when they receive that message.
Right.
They could be in a traffic jam. They could be dropping the kids off at school.
Right.
They could be really stressed.
Yeah.
And of course, there's that temptation just to reply. So, if they are already in an emotive state, and you don't know if they are, then that one message could backfire. And then what do we do when messages backfire? We keep messaging. We don't take that device that could solve all our problems if we were just to move it from in front of our face and up to our ear and use it for calling someone.
Yes.
We don't do that. We stay typing. And the reason for that, I think, is that receiving a message releases dopamine. And so, we type a message, we wait for the next message. So we're hooked on that message machine. And it's very hard to break away from that. So I think that confusing good writing with good grammar and spelling and punctuation is one thing, and over-relying on writing certainly is a major issue.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. I would even say, too, like generationally, there's differences, too, just in the way people write, and like emojis, for example, like, me being an older, I'm 54, I'll see my son will send me an emoji and I'm like, I don't know what that means. I have no clue. That's supposed to mean something, right? I don't know. And I've seen that even just in generational conversations, is that there's differences. There's references or things that they understand and they grew up with and we don't understand. So sometimes it's even just generationally, there can be differences in how the message was meant and how it was received. There's a disconnect.
Absolutely. You touch on a very important issue there, which is that language evolves. And there is, particularly with English, there is no rule book. Now, as I say that, I'm sure there are a lot of listeners going, whoa, hang on a minute. There are, Mr. Stevens in when I was at high school told me this,
Right, exactly. The Oxford comma, for example, that's a heavy debate.
Absolutely.
What is the rule?
It's a rule, but it's not. It's a style point. Going back to my editing days, we use the Chicago Style Guide, the Chicago Manual of Style from the University of Chicago Press, and that used the Oxford comma. But if you used a different style guide, that would say don't use the Oxford comma. And it's not a rule; it's just a style guide to ensure consistency.
Right.
But the language evolves. If you take, say, French as a comparison, you have the Académie Française who meet regularly and decide what words are allowed and what words aren't. They might be pushing against the tide on that one with a lot of things, but there are arbiters of the French language. Not so when it comes to English. But the language evolves, and you mentioned, if your son using emojis. Just a couple of years ago, it came to light, or it came to light to me because I wasn't aware of it, that putting a period mark or full stop at the end of a sentence or the end of a word in a text was passive aggressive.
Yes.
It's like,
and I do it all the time because I'm old.
You're kind of saying, no, I'm out of here. So it's the same here. Although I've stopped doing it now, which really goes against the grain because, being trained as an editor, it's like my daughter always gets me for how much I punctuate my text messages. Dad, you're the only person I know who uses apostrophes in his and good grammar, whatever that is. So.
Right. I love that. You say this, and I'd like to talk about it. You say the words we type shape our working relationships for better or for worse. What do you mean by that?
It is this issue that, or this phenomenon that we completely rely on the written word. Going back to this idea of limited capacity in the brain. So writing and reading are what psychologists call a low capacity channel. There's only so much you can get across. We make a lot of our decisions through emotion, even though we justify them with logic. And when you are reading something, when you're reading a message or reading an email, because there's all this activity going on underneath the hood, you're never far away from an emotional reaction. So because we stay stuck in writing, our relationships can kind of whipsaw everywhere. You don't know how someone is going to react when you write. Now, because I was looking into some research for this, just looking at this phenomenon, because particularly of COVID-19, the pandemic, and remote working, remote working is obviously it's huge. And I looked up some statistics, and 4/10 of US employers now. Only 4/10 of US employers insist on working full-time in the office now. It's been this huge change. Go back just a couple of years ago, and working from home was, it was a perk. It was something you had to really negotiate. Maybe, can I work at home on a Friday because I have a particularly grueling commute? Right. Whereas the tables have turned 180 degrees. And in fact, 7 out of 10 employees now say they want either a remote or a hybrid working style. And the number of job ads, consequently, that mention remote working tripled last year. Now, because of that, perhaps it's not surprising that that CEOs say one of their major challenges is getting people to work together effectively remotely.
Oh, yeah.
And, how do you do that? Well, we're tempted to say, well, Zoom, we spend all of our time on Zoom. But the fact is we don't. We may, even during the height of the pandemic, we had more meetings, but the meetings themselves were shorter.
Yeah.
And so instead, what are we doing? Think of all the time when you're not on Zoom, which is most of the time. What are you doing? You're writing. And so it's become this default activity. We don't think of it as writing, but we think of it as messaging, or we think of it as creating a proposal, or we think of it as managing our staff, or even getting rid of our email, which always makes me laugh. It's as if if we got rid of the email, then we could do the real work. Whereas the email is probably what's shaping the relationships with our customers and our employees anyway. That is the work a lot of the time. So it shapes our relationships because it's there in the background or even in the foreground, but we're just blind to it.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
One ping only, please. As I thought, John Rennie's new book, All in the Same Boat, is right over there. It's at allinthesameboatbook.com. Your orders are to get there now. And remember, be careful what you shoot at. Most things in here don't react too well to bullets.
Is your boss a jerk?
I understand you're in the hospital, but I'm going to need you to come in today.
Do they lack any ability to actually lead people?
Oh, it's fine. I'll just find somebody else that can do it, okay?
John is offering a new service just for you. For only $10, he will anonymously mail a copy of his best-selling book, I Have the Watch, to your boss with a personal note. Go to ihavethewatch.com and enter the discount code BOSS at checkout.
I think you're right with that. It's really the majority of our time. I think about my time in the office. I'm spending more time writing, whether it's emails or messages or than anything else. And you say something that's kind of interested to hear your take on it. You say that emails often make us angry. And why is that? Why do we have a natural emotional response sometimes to these emails that come in? What's happening in our brains when that happens?
Well, I think often what happens is we look for something to justify the way we feel.
Love this.
Last year, for instance, I was just over there in my office. I was looking for something in the under Eve's closet, and I stood up and I banged my head on the steel girder which shapes the window, and I saw stars. It was, I felt nauseous. It was awful. Anyway, I kind of regained my composure. I sat down, and the first thing I got was an email from a conference organizer. And to my shame, to my absolute shame, I replied in an I misinterpreted his email completely. I replied with an emotional response, and it was purely because I was in a bad mood. I was angry from hitting my head, and I was angry with myself. And yet I replied in an angry way. Of course, half an hour later, when I regained my composure, I realized what I'd done, and I emailed him back and I said, look, I'm really sorry. And he was very gracious about it. But, I think that the damage was probably done, and it's hard to imagine that didn't have some effect on our working relationship. Right. But I think often what happens is, we make, or there is some research, it's not what I think, there is research to show that we make decisions before we are aware of them. Yeah. So, microseconds before.
Oh, I can definitely see this. Yeah.
So you kind of sort of decisions make. You ever find yourself in an argument and you kind of say to yourself, don't say that. And yet you then say it. You kind of say to yourself, I mustn't respond like this. And then you do respond like that. Right. So that's with talking. When it comes to writing, we're already skating on thin ice. But the other thing is there was some research in the early 2000s that looked at the release of oxytocin. Now, oxytocin, it's sometimes called the love hormone or the hug hormone. It's more complicated than that, but it's a very, very important modulator of our relationships. It's a social lubricant. It helps manage our emotions and build relationships. And what this research showed is that if we're typing, if we read a message, then oxytocin isn't released. If we hear the message, then it is. I mean, in fact, it was a study between mothers and daughters, and it found that daughters were, if they heard their mother's voice, oxytocin was released. If they just read a text message from their mother, then it wasn't. And I think that's fascinating. I think that there's more research needed on that, but that could give us a clue for why we're more likely to lose it, I suppose, when we're reading a message than we are if we're actually speaking to somebody.
Yeah, and I just think about for me, I run a business. I have customers, and I have a few customers that are kind of pains in the neck. They're very needy and want, and they, we spend a lot of time trying to manage those customers. And I'll even just see an email come in from that customer, and I don't even open the email. It could be saying, "Hey, have a great day," but it doesn't matter. I just see an email. And I'm like, this guy again, I'm having an emotional reaction to an email coming in. And so when you said emails often make us angry, I live that. I see that. I'm like, this guy again, I got to deal with this, and we get an emotional, it's really interesting how that can affect us. And like you said, I think it's really important. You say, you responded emotionally to an email just after hitting your head, right? And so you were in the wrong mental state when you sent the email. I don't know how many times I've had to deal with, as 30 years in this as a leader, is when somebody sends an angry email because they respond right away to something that triggered them, and then they send an angry email, and then it just builds and it grows from there. And it's just, I had a boss once that said, if you're angry, don't send an email. So sleep on it, send it to the next day, and you tend to send a better response than if you're emotional in the moment,
Absolutely. I think the best thing you can do if you receive an email like that is to just quit Outlook or whatever, Gmail, whatever you're using. And then if you are going to reply, then first of all, to remove the person's email address from the to field. So you cannot send it until you're ready. Absolutely. But I think there's something else going on as well, which is with when we're using this low capacity channel of written communication. There was a great study a few years ago which looked at what the researchers did was they just tapped out a tune. And I'm not going to tap out a tune now, but if I had a tune in my head and I tapped it out, and it's really obvious to me. So let's say, it could be something as obvious as the Star Spangled Banner or Happy Birthday or something like that. Okay. Yeah. And it would be really, really obvious to me as I'm tapping it out, and I'm just tapping on my desk or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah.
You would be amazed how often, and it's most of the time, the listener cannot detect the tune from the tapping. It's a bit like, it's a bit like when you kind of, if you've got your headphones on or your earbuds in and you're listening to your favorite music and you're singing, and if anybody else happens to be in the room with you, and it sounds dreadful, but you've got this whole band in your head, and it's amazing. And that's what happens often when we're writing. We can hear the backing track. We're assuming all sorts of things, and we imagine that the reader, that the recipient will be listening to the same track. And of course they're not. You've got no idea what's going on in their head. And I think that's why so often it falls flat, or you get the reaction that you weren't expecting because they're listening to different audio. They can't hear the tune in your head.
I love that. That's really, really important. So the message that you intend to communicate is not received in the same way, a completely different way, because like you said, the tune is not even known. So that's interesting. What are some things that we need to remember when we're using written communication as a leader? What are some things that are kind of key things that we need to remember before we, put our hands on the keyboard?
I often joke three things: the reader, and the reader. But that's easier said than done. You've got to put yourself in the reader's shoes, but that's so difficult. So think, what do they know? How do they feel about this issue? What's important to them? So often when we start messages, we're thinking about ourselves, and that's because that's a default position. We're all the hero of our own story, right? So we are by default quite self-centered. So you start writing and you're thinking about your needs. So if you think, okay, if I were this person, what do I know about this person? What are their hot buttons? What buttons do I not want to press? And I have to say, as a word of warning there, just as a side note, if you are really overthinking things like that, if you're not overthinking, if you're finding that it's very, very complex, I want to mention this, but I don't want to mention that, and I've got to cover this. For goodness sake, pick up the phone.
That's a phone call.
Or hop on some kind of call. Because if that's really a kind of an alarm bell, If you're finding it's very, very complicated to write, then have a call. You can then confirm it in writing afterwards if you need to, and you want an audit trail. But don't rely on it. So, and definitely with emotive issues, then make sure you speak. I would say also never mistake brevity for efficiency. And this is something that, one of those bits of pseudoscience and these myths that that go around the internet. And there was something that went viral. It was a piece on a major blog. I think, pretty sure it was HBR blog. And it was about writing like the military. Okay, so very on point for this podcast. And the person who was a former soldier, the method he was advocating was to write in bullet points, but to start with to use in the subject line in all caps words, codes basically for what kind of category the communication was. And it might have been info or action, or one of them was coord for, it gets slightly kind of esoteric and confusing for coordinating. And I think there that what we're doing there is we think, okay, I need to be as efficient as possible. I will write a list of bullets. The biggest mistake we make is to think of the human brain as a computer, or even worse, an Excel spreadsheet, a database that's just there waiting for information. And the more information, the better. To think that if you want to help somebody make a decision, just give them more information. If you give somebody too much information, it triggers a circuit breaker. And you will end up with a very, very strange decision. We just stop making decisions, or we make really weird decisions. But don't just use a bullet list. It comes back to that hearing the background information, the backing track. A bullet list will mean everything to you, and it most likely nothing to the recipient. It's a bit like trying to pass an exam from somebody else's revision notes. It's kind of, and yet we think, well, bullets, great. They're really, really efficient. I use those. Everybody uses them. Of course, they're easier to write as well, which is probably something to do with it. Instead, you create some kind of narrative. And there is a selfish reason behind this as well, which is that if you give somebody a list of bullet points, they could do anything with them. You do not know what story they are going to make up as a result of the information you've given them. If you guide them, then you have a much better chance of getting the result you want. So I would say don't confuse brevity with effectiveness and efficiency. Certainly don't overuse bullets. If it's too complex, then pick up the phone. If it's emotive, then pick up the phone.
That makes a lot of sense. You said something that triggered me. You said that sometimes when we have a long email or a very deep, complex, I'm the reader. I'm maybe it's ex-military, but it's like, I get to the point, I got to make a decision here. If you send me a long email, I put it aside. I'm like, okay, this is going to take more time than I have time for. So I'll put it aside. And then, even then, I get about halfway through and I'm done. I'm going to respond. I want to take action. So you mentioned sometimes when we provide too much information, we get weird decisions. And I would say that I'm that guy. I'm making those weird decisions because you just threw too much at me, and I'm trying to find the important pieces here. And I just need to get to the point. I need to move forward. But if you're too brief, right, then I don't understand. Like, my response to you be like, I don't get it. What's the point? So there's a balance to be had between, brevity and being short, and then being too long, right? And part of that, as you mentioned earlier, is empathy and knowing who your listener is, or who your reader is, because I think there are some that want more detail. There's some that are quick to respond and what have you. So knowing who your audience is, I think is part of that how do I find that balance between too much or too little?
Absolutely, there is a sweet spot, and that sweet spot is different for everybody, which perhaps isn't that helpful to say. But if you suspect somebody might need more information, or rather, if a bit of background might help, you can have your main message and then say, I've pasted some notes below if you want more information. So it's a bit like an appendix. But there is another technique you can use for creating a narrative, even in a short email. And I call it SCRAP, the acronym SCRAP, which stands for situation, complication, resolution, action, and politeness. So the situation is where you are now. And that's important because if you hit somebody with a problem, then you are going to trigger that emotional reaction.
Yes.
So what you want is the reader to be nodding to begin with. Just put something safe in there that they can agree with.
Mm-hmm.
And it could be, we had a good meeting last week. Yes, we did. It was a good meeting. The complication is why you can't stay there. So here we are, where we are now, then why we can't stay there. So something's come up, for instance, or I was reading something or some extra information's come up, and here's a complication. So we need to do something. And then resolution. Resolution is you're not giving them a problem, you're giving them some way of solving it.
Yep.
So, that's great. They didn't know they had a problem before. Now they do. And it's like, oh no, and then you say, but I've come up with an answer. It's like, wow, great. So they're feeling better disposed to you already. And then action, which is what you need to do in order to implement that. And politeness, be great to work with you on this, or, let me know if you have any suggestions, or I always value your input, just some positive to end on. So, so that's SCRAP, SCRAP. It's very important to start with the situation, because scrap without the S is, well, it's not very good, is it? So, but that can really help when you've got a difficult email to send, even quite a short email. It's like, okay, how can I move this forward? But just use the SCRAP formula.
I love this. This is really good. I've got some notes here. To be honest with you, we have just scratched the surface, and we're running out of time. And I wanted to just say, how can people find out more about you and the work that you do, and they can find additional resources on this topic?
Well, the best place to go is influence.robashton.com/deep. So that's influence.robashton.com/deep. And I've put a page there for your listeners. They can sign up there for a short, free audio and e-course. So it's just 5 emails which cover the how to influence decision making through the way you write, with audio, because there's enough writing out there. Sometimes it's a lot easier just to listen. So there's an inbuilt audio player. But they can find a link there to my website from there, and information on my training company as well. So if they go there, that should sort them.
Okay, that's fantastic. We'll put that link in the show notes. But this has been incredible, Rob. Like I said, we just scratched the surface of this topic. It is very important. You have helped me to see that most of our communication is in writing, and whether it's a text, an email, Slack channel. We're doing a lot of writing, and we're probably making a lot of mistakes as leaders. And so hopefully this discussion help people understand a little bit about, think about this a little bit more, and they can go to your resources and to find out more about the topic. So, Rob, I really appreciate you coming on the show and sharing all of this insight. It's been eye-opening for me, and I've got a page of notes here. So I really appreciate you coming on the show.
It's been an absolute pleasure, John. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Well, thank you again. Well, that's it for today. Thank you for listening to Deep Leadership. If you like this podcast, please subscribe and share so we can continue to build a world with better bosses. Until next time, this is John Rennie saying take care and lead well.
Thank you for listening to Deep Leadership.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you for all you do.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode. For more information and updates, please visit our website at www.deepleadershippodcast.com or johnsrennie.com. Until next time, Take care.
Hey there, I'm DC. I host the Rock Podcast, Back to the Arena, The Interviews. It's about a 30-minute podcast where I talk one-on-one with a band who has released new music. You can find us on all the best podcast sites like Spotify, Apple, Google, iHeartRadio, and more. If you're a rock fan like me, subscribe today to Back to the Arena, The Interviews.
Electricast.
Welcome to Ringside with Ray and Prince. My name is Ray Leonard Jr.
Oh, was that the set? No, that's just my dad.
My name is Prince Daniels Jr.
Daniels again with a big home touchdown. On this show, we come to humanize
athletes, entertainers, business executives. We're going to see what makes them tick.
Tuesdays, 10 a.m. Pacific time on Spotify, Apple, Amazon, and wherever you get your podcasts.
We'll see you there. Peace and power.
Electricast.